Hello. In today's video, we're going to explore what questions. Are you ready? Let's get started. What do you do every day? What time do you get up? What do you eat for lunch? What do you do after school? What do you watch on TV? What do you do at school? What do you need for English class? What do you usually write in your notebook? What do you like doing in your free time? What kind of music do you listen to? What sports do you play? What games do you like? What time is it? What day is it today? What is the date today? What do you take on holiday? What do you do at the beach? What is your favorite city? What do you need for a trip? What do you usually do in your free time? What kind of music do you enjoy? What is your favorite food and why? What languages can you speak? What do you like most about your country? What time do you usually wake up? What do you normally eat for breakfast? What do you do on weekends? What is your daily routine like? What do you usually do after work or school? What countries have you visited? What is your favorite place you've ever been to? What do you need to take when you go on holiday? What is the best way to travel in your city? What subjects did you enjoy at school? What do you do for a living? What skills are important for your job? What do you want to buy? What color is your t-shirt? What size do you wear? What do you usually buy at the supermarket? What do you need to buy for school? What is your favorite drink? What do you eat for dinner? What snacks do you like? What do you cook at home? What do you wear to school? What do you do before you go to bed? What do you do in the morning? What do you usually do on Sundays? What do you take to school every day? What apps do you use on your phone? What is your favorite video game? What do you do on your computer? What animals live in the forest? What do you see at the zoo? What makes you happy? What do you do when you are sad? What do you like about your school? What do you want for your birthday? What do you think about homework? What do you usually do on weekends? What kind of music do you like? What subjects do you find difficult? What do you want to do after graduation? What is your dream job? What did you learn at school today? What do you need to bring to the meeting? What time do you usually wake up? What do you like to eat for breakfast? What hobbies do you enjoy in your free time? What countries have you visited? What do you like about your hometown? What habits help you stay organized? What causes do you care deeply about? What inventions have changed the world the most? What traditions are important in your culture? What hobbies would you like to try in the future? What lessons have you learned from your mistakes? What factors influence your decisions? What types of films make you think deeply? What are the benefits of learning a foreign language? What risks are worth taking in life? What role does technology play in your daily routine? What activities help you boost your creativity? What items do you always carry in your bag or pocket? What situations make you feel nervous or excited? What skills would you like to develop this year? What kind of environment helps you focus? What steps can people take to reduce stress? What qualities should a good leader have? What problems are most urgent in the world today? What can individuals do to protect the environment? What do you think schools should teach about climate change? What makes a city comfortable to live in? What actions can improve life in your local community? What does success mean to you? What do you think is the key to happiness? What would you change in your education system if you could? What do you believe is more important, talent or hard work? What would you do if you had unlimited time for 1 year? What do you consider your greatest achievement so far? What do you want to improve about yourself this year? What habits have helped you become more productive? What fears have you overcome in your life? What does confidence mean to you? What would you do if you had the chance to live abroad? What would your dream home look like? What project would you start if you had more free time? What role do robots and automation play in our future? What new technology would you like to try? What do you think about the use of AI in education? What should children learn about technology at school? What are the disadvantages of spending too much time online? What helps people build strong relationships? What situations require polite or formal language? What do you usually talk about with close friends? What is the most important part of good communication? What do people often misunderstand about you? What would you do if you could live one day in the past? What would you invent to make life easier? What superpower would you choose and why? What would the world look like without the internet? What would your perfect weekend include? What are some cultural differences you've noticed while traveling? What do you like most about learning other cultures? What subjects were most interesting to you at school? What do you think makes a movie unforgettable? What kind of weather do you enjoy the most, and why? What do you usually do when you're feeling bored? What do you notice first when meeting someone new? What foods remind you of your childhood? What do you usually do when you need to make a big decision? What personal qualities help people succeed in life? What do you find most difficult about learning English? What do you admire about people from other cultures? What are some things that make you feel proud? What do you believe is the biggest challenge young people face today? What do you usually look for when choosing a place to eat? What songs or types of music make you feel better? What would you bring with you to a deserted island? What do you wish people talked about more often? What makes someone a good listener? What qualities do you look for in a good friend? What can people do to handle conflict more effectively? What kind of news stories do you usually pay attention to? What does your ideal day off look like? What helps you stay positive during difficult times? What do you usually do when you can't sleep? What makes a place feel like home to you? What do you think is the most important invention of all time? What advice would you give to someone learning your language? What do you usually do when your plans change suddenly? What do you think people misunderstand about your culture? What would you do if you had to start over in a new country? What do you usually do when you're waiting for something? What makes someone a great public speaker? What would your dream holiday include? What are some common goals people set in life? What kind of art do you enjoy looking at or creating? What do you find interesting about history? What qualities make a good team member? What motivates you to get out of bed in the morning? What do you enjoy most about your favorite season? What are some habits that help you stay healthy? What makes you feel truly appreciated? What do you usually do when you want to treat yourself? What kind of decisions are hardest for you to make? What would you change about your daily routine if you could? What types of apps do you think are most useful? What do you find most satisfying about finishing a big task? What do you think about the idea of lifelong learning? What is something you've recently discovered about yourself? What would you do differently if you had more confidence? What kinds of situations bring out your best qualities? What do you think about spending time in nature? What do you do when you need to clear your mind? What would your perfect evening at home include? What are some important things people should learn in school but often don't? What do you enjoy doing that others might find boring? What is the most challenging part of being an adult? What do you think is the key to a successful relationship? What makes a place or event feel special to you? What do you like to do when you're feeling creative? What would you do if you could meet any historical figure? What are some qualities of a good decision maker? What would be your ideal way to spend a Saturday? What kind of movies do you like to watch when you need to relax? What part of your routine are you most proud of? What do you think is the best way to deal with difficult people? What would you say to someone who's feeling discouraged? What's the most memorable gift you've ever received? What does your dream job look like? What is something you've learned recently that surprised you? What kind of sports do you enjoy watching or playing? What kind of change would you like to see in your community? What makes someone trustworthy in your opinion? What is something you've done that pushed you out of your comfort zone? What factors do you think contribute to the success of a global organization? What role do ethics play in the decisions we make in our personal and professional lives? What impact do you think social media has on our perception of reality? What influence do cultural norms have on an individual's behavior and worldview? What is your opinion on the idea that money cannot buy happiness? What are the potential consequences of artificial intelligence surpassing human intelligence? What makes a society truly progressive, in your view? What are the most effective ways to balance economic growth and environmental sustainability? What is the role of education in preparing individuals for the complexities of modern life? What do you believe is the key to fostering true global cooperation in the 21st century? What is the importance of critical thinking in today's information-saturated world? What do you think are the long-term effects of living in a highly connected, digital world? What changes would you advocate for in the global healthcare system? What role do the arts play in shaping societal values and individual identities? What makes a democratic society function well? And what can jeopardize its stability? What is the significance of historical memory in shaping national identity? What do you think are the biggest challenges to achieving world peace in the modern era? What are the ethical implications of gene editing and biotechnological advancements? What is the relationship between freedom and responsibility in a democratic society? What is the importance of having a growth mindset, and how can it be cultivated? What do you think about the future of space exploration, and how should we prioritize its development? What makes a leader effective in times of crisis, and how do their actions impact society? What factors contribute to the way we perceive success, and how can these perceptions shape our decisions? What happens when we allow our insecurities to influence our relationships with others? What role does uncertainty play in personal growth, and how can we learn to embrace it? What assumptions do people often make without realizing, and how can we challenge them? What responsibilities do individuals have when it comes to shaping public opinion? What distinguishes true innovation from mere improvement? What role should emotion play in decision-making processes? What factors influence how history is remembered or rewritten? What do you think defines personal identity in an increasingly globalized world? What are the psychological effects of constant digital connectivity on human behavior? What do you think makes an idea powerful enough to change the world? What ethical dilemmas arise in journalism, especially in times of crisis? What impact does language have on how we perceive the world? What do you think is lost when communication shifts from face-to-face to online platforms? What role should art and literature play in political or social movements? What are the long-term effects of consumer culture on both individuals and society? What are the consequences of prioritizing efficiency over well-being in modern work culture? What does success truly mean in the context of a fulfilling life? What does the rise of automation mean for human creativity and purpose? What societal values are reflected in the way we treat the elderly or vulnerable? What might be the unintended consequences of rapidly advancing medical technology? What does it mean to live an authentic life in today's world? What challenges do multicultural societies face in preserving both diversity and unity? What are the limits of freedom of expression in a democratic society? What is the role of empathy in resolving international conflicts? What historical event do you think has had the most lasting influence on the modern world, and why? What do current global migration patterns reveal about inequality and opportunity? What role should the media play in holding governments accountable? What are the moral responsibilities of wealthy nations toward developing countries? What do you think are the roots of polarization in modern societies? What do cultural attitudes toward time say about a society's values? What does it mean to be truly independent in a world of constant interdependence? What can literature teach us about the human condition that science cannot? What impact does nostalgia have on decision-making and progress? What role do symbols and rituals play in maintaining cultural identity? What psychological effects can long-term exposure to negative news have on individuals? What is the relationship between innovation and ethical responsibility? What challenges arise when trying to preserve endangered languages? What defines a just law? And can something legal still be immoral? What is the role of dissent in a healthy democracy? What assumptions underlie the idea of progress, and are they always valid? What does your environment reveal about your values and priorities? What are the social consequences of viewing education as a commodity? What makes a philosophical question different from a practical one? What is the value of doubt in intellectual and personal growth? What kind of leadership is most effective in a rapidly changing world? What do privacy and surveillance mean in an age of mass data collection? What is the relationship between tradition and innovation in cultural development? What are the ethical limits of artistic expression? What do utopian visions of society reveal about real-world fears and hopes? What drives people to conform to social expectations, even when they disagree with them? What shapes a person's worldview more? Experience or education? What are the implications of living in an attention economy? What does it mean to have a moral compass in today's complex world? What defines cultural appropriation? And where is the line between appreciation and exploitation? What lessons can be learned from the collapse of past civilizations? What role does failure play in personal development and resilience? What does being well-informed mean in an era of misinformation? What is the relationship between economic inequality and political instability? What ethical questions are raised by the development of human enhancement technologies? What is the value of silence in a society obsessed with constant communication? What do architectural styles reveal about a society's identity and values? What are the dangers of using history to justify present-day actions? What is the relationship between national pride and nationalism? What does it mean to live sustainably? And is it achievable at a global scale? What role does storytelling play in shaping our understanding of truth? What consequences might arise from delegating moral decisions to machines? What are the limits of scientific knowledge, and how should society respond to them? What influence does collective memory have on how societies evolve? What do conspiracy theories reveal about the psychology of belief? What does it mean to lead a meaningful life? And who defines that meaning? What are the implications of redefining success in non-material terms? What should be prioritized? Individual rights or collective responsibility? What role does imagination play in scientific and technological breakthroughs? What impact does global interconnectedness have on cultural authenticity? What drives humanity's search for meaning in a seemingly chaotic world? What role does identity politics play in shaping modern democracies? What does the concept of truth mean in an age of deepfakes and manipulated media? What are the psychological impacts of living in a society driven by performance and achievement? What responsibilities do artists have when representing sensitive social issues? What does it mean for something to be considered normal? And who defines that standard? What role does uncertainty play in scientific progress? What can fiction reveal about reality that non-fiction cannot? What are the implications of redefining intelligence beyond academic performance? What should be prioritized? Individual rights or collective responsibility? What role does imagination play in scientific and technological breakthroughs? What impact does global interconnectedness have on cultural authenticity? What do utopian or dystopian narratives reveal about a society's collective hopes and fears? What happens when the pursuit of security begins to limit individual freedom? What are the philosophical implications of living in a simulation, if that were proven true? What does language reveal about the way we structure our reality? What defines authenticity in an era of digital branding and curated identities? What responsibilities do individuals have in preserving cultural heritage in a globalized world? What might be the consequences of a world without physical borders? What is the role of suffering in personal growth or spiritual development? What impact does algorithm-driven content have on how we form beliefs and opinions? What does the commodification of wellness say about modern life? What do recurring myths or archetypes tell us about the human subconscious? What should be prioritized in education? Adaptability, knowledge, or creativity? What does it mean to be free in a world that is increasingly interconnected and regulated? What makes a moral argument compelling across different cultures and belief systems? What is lost when traditional ways of life disappear in the name of progress? What responsibilities come with having influence in a digital age? What does it mean to act ethically when the consequences of actions are uncertain? What can dreams reveal about the unconscious mind and identity? What does the pursuit of perfection tell us about human nature? What are the consequences of valuing productivity over presence? What role does forgiveness play in both personal and collective healing? What does it mean to truly understand another person's perspective? What patterns in history seem to repeat themselves, and why? What determines whether a conflict is justifiable or not? What can be learned from contradictions in human behavior? What is the relationship between imagination and empathy? What does it mean to take responsibility for the unintended consequences of your actions? What does our relationship with time say about modern culture? What is the role of beauty in human experience and decision-making? What happens to language when it is used to manipulate rather than to communicate? What are the ethical limits of scientific experimentation on humans or animals? What is the value of boredom in a world driven by constant stimulation? What does it mean to be educated in the 21st century? What role should historical guilt or collective memory play in shaping national policy? What defines courage in the face of uncertainty or moral ambiguity? What do our fears reveal about our values and priorities? What does the digital divide reveal about inequality in modern society? What are the long-term consequences of valuing convenience over depth? What happens when individual freedom clashes with the common good? What does the rise of individualism mean for community and social cohesion? What factors influence whether a society values conformity or independence? What does it mean to belong in an increasingly globalized and mobile world? What role does fear play in shaping political and economic systems? What are the implications of outsourcing moral decisions to algorithms? What does it mean to live authentically in a culture of performance and comparison? What happens when data becomes more powerful than personal experience? What do generational differences reveal about how society evolves? What is the function of public space in democratic societies? What values are reflected in the way we treat animals, both culturally and legally? What does the way we consume information say about our intellectual habits? What are the long-term psychological effects of constant digital surveillance? What happens when truth becomes subjective in public discourse? What is the connection between memory and identity, both individually and collectively? What drives people to believe in conspiracy theories, even in the face of evidence? What does our relationship with failure reveal about societal expectations? What should be the role of discomfort in personal growth and education? What do human rights mean when applied across vastly different cultures? What happens when technology evolves faster than ethics can keep up? What makes a narrative powerful enough to shape public opinion or history? What does the popularity of minimalism or decluttering trends say about modern anxiety? What are the ethical implications of cancel culture and public accountability? What role should emotional intelligence play in leadership and policymaking? What would change if education focused more on asking the right questions than finding the right answers? What are the consequences of prioritizing short-term results over long-term impact? What does resistance to change reveal about human psychology or social systems? What does it mean to act with integrity when no one is watching? What happens when cultural heritage is commercialized for tourism? What role do emotions play in shaping historical and political narratives? What is the value of philosophical thinking in everyday life? What defines a meaningful apology, both personally and politically? What does your relationship with time say about your values? What impact does overexposure to tragedy in the media have on empathy? What is the relationship between power and responsibility in modern institutions? What drives the human tendency to create in-groups and out-groups? What makes a protest movement effective, and what limits its influence? What assumptions underlie the idea of constant self-optimization? What would a society look like that prioritized care over competition? What defines truth in an age of competing narratives and perspectives? What role does humor play in coping with difficult social realities? What are the ethical limits of influence in advertising and branding? What can urban design teach us about social inequality? What makes a cultural critique insightful rather than simply provocative? What are the dangers of simplifying complex problems into binary choices? What does multilingualism offer that monolingualism cannot? What happens to collective identity in times of global crisis? What are the risks of romanticizing the past in public discourse? What does the future of work demand from education today? What role does curiosity play in sustaining lifelong learning? What determines whether a tradition should be preserved or reformed? What are the implications of defining intelligence through standardized testing? What role does uncertainty play in both creativity and scientific discovery? What does the rise of influencer culture say about our relationship with authenticity? What does it mean to decolonize knowledge, and why does it matter? What happens when convenience becomes a higher priority than ethics? What is the connection between emotional resilience and societal stability? What makes collective silence powerful in the face of injustice? What are the ethical implications of virtual relationships replacing real-world interaction? What assumptions underlie the idea that progress is always positive? What role does nostalgia play in shaping political ideologies? What does it mean to listen deeply in a world full of noise? What kind of knowledge can only come from lived experience? What happens to personal agency in highly controlled systems, e.g., schools, prisons, algorithms? What is the role of imagination in redefining what's possible? What makes a worldview inclusive rather than dogmatic? What are the risks of mistaking information for wisdom? What do beauty standards reveal about deeper cultural anxieties? What is the emotional cost of constant connectivity? What happens when language becomes politicized? What role should discomfort play in education and growth? What is the purpose of art in times of social or political crisis? What does the way we treat failure say about our values as a society? What defines a fair distribution of wealth in a globalized economy? What role should personal values play in shaping public policy? What happens when freedom of choice conflicts with social responsibility? What does the desire for permanence reveal about human nature? What are the psychological effects of living in a society obsessed with speed? What assumptions are hidden in the way we define success? What are the ethical implications of profiting from crisis or disaster? What role does vulnerability play in leadership and influence? What does the commodification of identity mean for individual freedom? What happens when we value efficiency more than empathy? What is lost when language is reduced to transactional purposes only? What forms of power are the most invisible, and why are they dangerous? What does it mean to live ethically in a world of systemic inequality? What role do silence and inaction play in perpetuating injustice? What do rituals teach us about belonging and belief? What happens when the pursuit of objectivity ignores lived experience? What role should imagination play in solving real-world problems? What does burnout reveal about the structure of modern work culture? What do our obsessions with productivity suggest about our sense of self-worth? What are the consequences of confusing visibility with representation? What does the evolution of language say about cultural power dynamics? What happens when personal data becomes currency? What do emotional responses reveal that logic cannot explain? What does it mean to act with integrity in a morally complex world? What happens when individual ambition undermines collective well-being? What role does storytelling play in shaping historical truths? What defines a meaningful contribution to society? What can be learned from contradictions within one's own beliefs? What are the dangers of equating visibility with impact? What is the role of emotional labor in modern relationships and workplaces? What happens when we stop questioning what's considered normal? What does resistance look like in systems designed to absorb dissent? What makes knowledge empowering instead of oppressive? What does it mean to deconstruct an idea? And why is that valuable? What happens when the desire for certainty overrides critical thinking? What is the role of pause and reflection in a culture of instant reaction? What does the rise of personal branding suggest about identity today? What are the limits of cultural sensitivity in global dialogue? What makes a civic space truly democratic? What does it mean to live ethically when every action has global consequences? What happens when institutions lose the trust of the people they serve? What do shifting gender norms reveal about deeper societal change? What role do contradictions play in human development? What is the relationship between dignity and autonomy? What happens to dialogue when disagreement is seen as a threat? What does silence reveal that words often conceal? What is the price of convenience in an interconnected world? What does our response to failure say about our understanding of success? What role does discomfort play in meaningful personal transformation? What does it mean to unlearn, and why is it important? What do popular myths or metaphors reveal about cultural fears and desires? What happens when efficiency replaces human connection in daily life? What makes a question powerful enough to change someone's thinking? What is the relationship between silence and power in political or social settings? What are the ethical responsibilities of creators in shaping public discourse? What happens to a democracy when political debate becomes entertainment? What does our treatment of the environment say about our relationship with time? What defines a truly informed decision in a world of constant information flow? What does it mean to be a responsible global citizen in the 21st century? What happens when compassion conflicts with justice? What role does skepticism play in maintaining intellectual freedom? What makes something sacred in a secular world? What are the consequences of defining people by their productivity? What happens when imagination is undervalued in education or policy? What does the pursuit of neutrality reveal about a fear of conflict? What role should hope play in critical thinking and decision-making? What does your inner dialogue reveal about how you see the world? What are the limits of empathy, and can it be taught? What happens when empathy is weaponized or manipulated? What does it mean to find purpose in a system that may not reflect your values? What are the implications of romanticizing struggle or hardship? What does the outsourcing of decision-making to machines mean for human agency? What makes an idea worth defending at great personal cost? What does the language we use around failure reveal about cultural expectations? What happens when the concept of truth becomes fluid or negotiable? What does it mean to live a reflective life, and why does it matter? What is the role of emotional complexity in ethical decision-making? What can be revealed by what a society chooses to censor? What does the pursuit of objectivity overlook about the human experience? What is the relationship between ritual and meaning in a secular society? What do paradoxes teach us about the limits of rational thinking? What is the role of contradiction in forming a well-rounded worldview? What happens to accountability when blame becomes collective? What makes a silence meaningful instead of empty? What do the stories we tell ourselves about the future reveal about the present? What happens when we confuse comfort with happiness? What is lost when tradition becomes performative rather than lived? What role does humility play in intellectual growth? What are the unintended consequences of measuring everything? What happens when social change moves faster than psychological adaptation? What defines emotional maturity in times of crisis or uncertainty? What does it mean to live ethically when your lifestyle depends on invisible systems? What happens when we mistake visibility for validation? What do cycles of burnout reveal about how we value energy and rest? What is the relationship between inner peace and external chaos? What happens when the need for clarity overrides acceptance of ambiguity? What does it mean to be educated beyond formal schooling? What are the moral risks of detachment in a hyperconnected world? What defines emotional intelligence in cultures where emotion is suppressed? What do minimalist trends suggest about cultural reactions to excess? What happens when criticism is silenced in the name of unity? What do we learn from the stories societies choose to erase? What is the role of surrender in a culture obsessed with control? What makes belonging more than just inclusion? What does the commodification of mindfulness say about modern stress? What happens when language fails to capture lived experience? What is the impact of growing up in a world with no clear truth? What does loyalty mean in a time of shifting allegiances and identities? What role should doubt play in spiritual or ideological conviction? What are the consequences of framing everything as a problem to be solved? What happens when freedom becomes the justification for harm? What defines a meaningful disagreement? What do our fears around silence and solitude reveal about modern life? What is the cost of constant accessibility in a world without boundaries? What do generational tensions reveal about shifting definitions of progress? What happens when tradition becomes a barrier to justice? What does the desire for certainty reveal about our tolerance for complexity? What makes a belief system adaptive to change rather than rigid? What do the metaphors we use in language reveal about hidden power structures? What is the role of grief in shaping personal and collective identity? What happens when empathy becomes selective or performative? What does your reaction to discomfort say about your relationship with growth? What is the value of doubt in an age of overconfidence? What defines authenticity when identity is curated online? What are the consequences of treating education as a transaction? What happens to personal freedom in systems built on surveillance and prediction? What does the normalization of crisis say about cultural resilience or fatigue? What are the hidden costs of upward mobility? What role does disobedience play in social transformation? What makes a voice trustworthy in a world full of competing narratives? What do habits reveal about unconscious values and priorities? What is the emotional impact of being constantly observed, rated, or judged? What happens when urgency is used to bypass ethical reflection? What does it mean to belong when identity is fragmented across roles and contexts? What are the dangers of equating morality with legality? What makes a community resilient in the face of rapid change? What does the glamorization of hustle culture reveal about insecurity and validation? What is the role of pause in systems that reward momentum? What happens when we confuse data with meaning? What happens when we mistake productivity for purpose? What does your reaction to silence reveal about your inner world? What role does moral imagination play in solving global problems? What do the boundaries we set say about our understanding of self and other? What happens when the pursuit of happiness becomes an obligation? What does burnout reveal about the narratives we accept about work and worth? What is the emotional impact of constant comparison in digital spaces? What do moments of crisis reveal about true priorities? What is the role of beauty in social justice or resistance? What happens when we outsource human connection to convenience? What does the persistence of inequality say about the limits of intention? What defines wisdom in an age of accelerating information? What happens when attention becomes a commodity? What do rituals of consumption say about modern spirituality? What makes rest an act of resistance in a performance-driven culture? What is the relationship between memory and responsibility? What does it mean to live a coherent life across shifting roles and identities? What happens when forgiveness is expected before accountability? What do your definitions of success reveal about inherited values? What role should uncertainty play in leadership and influence? What makes a question more powerful than an answer? What do cultural taboos reveal about collective fears? What is lost when life becomes a series of metrics? What does your emotional vocabulary say about your worldview? What role does irony play in cultures that fear vulnerability? What do forgotten histories reveal about power and preservation? What happens when empathy is expected but not reciprocated? What does your reaction to uncertainty reveal about your coping mechanisms? What defines emotional depth in a time of distraction? What do systems of reward reveal about what a society truly values? What happens when care becomes conditional? What does the language of self-care obscure about collective responsibility? What is the cost of always being connected, but rarely present? What makes a tradition worth questioning or defending? What do your daily routines reveal about your subconscious beliefs? What happens when silence is mistaken for agreement? What does it mean to be well-informed in a time of curated content? What role does imagination play in challenging injustice? What do our entertainment choices suggest about our unresolved emotions? What happens when the line between public and private disappears? What defines fulfillment in a world of limitless distraction? What does emotional numbness reveal about cultural burnout? What are the consequences of confusing neutrality with safety? What happens when we reduce people to the worst things they've done? What does the way we respond to silence reveal about our relationship with discomfort? What happens when collective memory becomes politically inconvenient? What does your definition of success exclude or ignore? What is the difference between influence and manipulation? And who decides? What do boundaries protect and what might they prevent? What happens when innovation outpaces moral reflection? What does your attention gravitate toward, and what does that suggest about your needs? What makes a space feel psychologically safe, and why does it matter? What is the emotional impact of always needing to be on? What happens when belonging is conditional on conformity? What does the celebration of resilience sometimes conceal? What does the desire for certainty cost us in creativity or curiosity? What makes a perspective trustworthy in a world of competing truths? What does your reaction to contradiction suggest about your mindset? What happens when efficiency is prioritized over humanity? What are the emotional consequences of perpetual multitasking? What do our fears around stillness reveal about our sense of identity? What happens when apology becomes a performance? What does it mean to live consciously in a reactive world? What is the cost of always seeking closure? What do your habits of consumption suggest about your values? What does your resistance to change often protect? What makes a question dangerous or liberating? What happens when love is treated as a transaction? What does the normalization of distraction mean for depth? What does your reaction to being misunderstood reveal about your communication style? What happens when convenience erodes our sense of connection? What does it mean to outgrow a belief? And how do we recognize it? What are the risks of making curiosity conditional on comfort? What does your inner critic sound like? And where did it come from? What happens when the narrative of progress obscures harm? What makes a pause powerful in conversation, culture, or change? What do our escape mechanisms suggest about unresolved needs? What is lost when identity becomes branded? What happens when we confuse activity with meaning? What does your need for control protect you from? What role does contradiction play in authentic growth? What happens when transparency is weaponized instead of respected? What does the fear of irrelevance say about our relationship with legacy? What defines presence in an age of distraction? What does over-explaining reveal about perceived power dynamics? What are the ethical costs of always being neutral? What happens when we view discomfort as failure rather than feedback? What does urgency often mask in personal or political conversations? What does your silence say in moments that demand voice? What is the difference between being informed and being wise? What makes you feel seen, and why? What happens when we inherit language that doesn't match our reality? What do our digital selves reflect, and what do they distort? What does your definition of enough reveal about your fears and hopes? What happens when we begin to view the world only through the lens of our own experience? What does it mean to live authentically when society demands conformity? What happens when we prioritize progress over preservation? What does the constant quest for validation reveal about modern identity? What is the role of vulnerability in intellectual and emotional growth? What happens when we commodify personal growth or healing? What does the language of self-improvement obscure about cultural expectations? What makes a story worth telling, and why? What does your relationship with time reveal about your values? What happens when the fear of missing out leads to a fear of commitment? What does it mean to lead with empathy, and when is that not enough? What role does discomfort play in the process of meaningful change? What does our obsession with certainty say about our culture's relationship with risk? What happens when we treat the world as a resource to be consumed rather than a community to be nurtured? What does it mean to be truly free in a world that often rewards compliance? What happens when we define ourselves solely by what we do, not who we are? What does nostalgia reveal about our perception of progress and change? What happens when we mistake ease for value? What does the erosion of privacy mean for the future of personal freedom? What happens when we treat relationships as transactions instead of connections? What does the desire for certainty say about our ability to navigate complexity? What happens when convenience becomes more important than connection? What does your reaction to failure reveal about your relationship with success? What happens when we treat emotions as obstacles to be managed, rather than signals to be understood? What does your attachment to comfort protect you from? What happens when we reduce people to their most visible traits? What does your response to criticism reveal about your sense of self? What happens when we confuse intention with impact? What does the fear of being judged say about our relationship with authenticity? What is the cost of living in a world that demands constant productivity? What happens when we silence voices that challenge the status quo? What does your relationship with technology reveal about your priorities in life? What is the impact of framing every challenge as a problem to be solved? What happens when we mistake convenience for progress? What does your emotional reaction to change reveal about your underlying values? What does our obsession with self-sufficiency say about our understanding of community? What happens when we stop questioning the systems that shape our lives? What is the role of hope in motivating action, and what happens when hope is lost? What happens when we prioritize individualism over collective well-being? What does the increasing prevalence of artificial intelligence mean for human creativity? What happens when we expect others to share our values without understanding their experiences? What does your definition of justice exclude? And what does that say about your worldview? What happens when we prioritize speed over depth in personal and professional life? What does your reaction to ambiguity say about your need for control? What is the role of ethical responsibility in shaping technological innovation? What happens when we normalize inequality in the name of progress? What does your emotional response to change reveal about your attachment to the past? What is the impact of constantly measuring success in terms of external achievement? What happens when we confuse knowledge with wisdom? What does the desire for comfort reveal about our ability to confront reality? What happens when we stop valuing empathy in favor of efficiency? What does your relationship with time say about your perception of the future? What happens when we rely on superficial connections instead of deep, meaningful relationships? What does the pursuit of perfection obscure about the beauty of imperfection? What happens when we disconnect our individual struggles from collective challenges? What does your ability to forgive reveal about your understanding of justice? What happens when we treat the planet as an infinite resource rather than a finite ecosystem? What does your fear of failure say about your relationship with risk? What happens when we ignore the voices of those who are different from us? What is the impact of social media on how we define our self-worth? What happens when we prioritize individual rights over collective responsibility? What does your reaction to vulnerability reveal about your emotional intelligence? What happens when we lose our capacity for critical thought in the face of mass media? What does the overuse of technology do to our ability to form authentic human connections? What happens when we focus too much on the how and not enough on the why? What does your relationship with material wealth reveal about your values? What happens when we forget that every action has both immediate and long-term consequences? What happens when we mistake distraction for rest? What does your reaction to other people's vulnerability say about your emotional openness? What is the cost of constantly reinventing yourself to meet others' expectations? What happens when moral outrage becomes performative? What does the desire to fix everything say about our discomfort with uncertainty? What role does boredom play in creativity and insight? What happens when self-care becomes commodified rather than compassionate? What does it mean to grow when growth is not visible or measurable? What does your discomfort with silence reveal about your inner dialogue? What happens when we lose faith in the systems meant to protect us? What do your priorities in times of stress reveal about your deepest values? What happens when fear is disguised as logic in public discourse? What does it mean to truly listen in a world driven by reaction? What are the consequences of centering productivity in all areas of life? What does your reaction to other people's success reveal about your sense of self? What happens when collective trauma goes unacknowledged? What do we risk when we avoid difficult conversations for the sake of harmony? What happens when hope is used to avoid accountability? What does your need for closure reveal about your relationship with ambiguity? What is the role of contradiction in maintaining both personal and social balance? What happens when urgency is mistaken for importance? What does the pressure to be original reveal about our fear of insignificance? What do habitual reactions reveal about unconscious narratives we've internalized? What happens when compassion is seen as weakness in leadership? What does your emotional response to others' silence reveal about your own sense of security? What happens when convenience overrides intention in our daily choices? What does your definition of normal say about your exposure to difference? What does your emotional response to others' silence reveal about your own sense of security? What happens when convenience overrides intention in our daily choices? What does your definition of normal say about your exposure to difference? What is lost when we prioritize being agreeable over being honest? What happens when algorithms begin to shape not just what we see, but what we believe? What does your need to explain yourself say about your relationship with judgment? What role does discomfort play in the development of moral courage? What happens when we define ourselves by our pain rather than our purpose? What does your sense of urgency reveal about what you're avoiding? What happens when praise is more about the giver than the receiver? What does it mean to create meaning in a world saturated with distraction? What does the glorification of resilience hide about structural harm? What happens when choice becomes overwhelming instead of empowering? What does it mean to be honest when truth is inconvenient? What happens when our coping mechanisms become part of our identity? What does your reaction to being challenged say about your openness to growth? What does your public persona obscure about your private self? What happens when kindness becomes a performance rather than a principle? What does the inability to sit with boredom say about our attention economy? What role does discomfort play in authentic learning? What does it mean to be informed without being overwhelmed? What happens when boundaries are mistaken for rejection? What does your fear of being misunderstood reveal about your relationship with authenticity? What does your definition of independence ignore about interdependence? What happens when empathy becomes emotionally exhausting? What happens when we confuse being busy with being fulfilled? What does your resistance to vulnerability reveal about how you define strength? What happens when digital validation becomes central to self-worth? What does the way you handle endings say about your capacity for growth? What do your repeated patterns reveal about unexamined beliefs? What happens when we equate emotional detachment with maturity? What does your fear of missing out reveal about your relationship with presence? What is the emotional toll of always having to be fine? What happens when we avoid discomfort by intellectualizing emotion? What does your inner narrative sound like when no one is watching? What do the roles you play in different settings reveal about your identity? What happens when we choose silence in the face of harm? What does your need for closure say about your tolerance for open endings? What happens when forgiveness is expected but not earned? What do your aspirations say about what you've been taught to value? What happens when truth and loyalty come into conflict? What does your relationship with solitude reveal about your emotional needs? What do the questions you avoid say about your fears? What happens when we define healing as a straight line? What does your interpretation of fairness reveal about your worldview? What happens when language fails to express emotional complexity? What does your desire for validation say about your sense of self-worth? What role does anger play in revealing suppressed values? What does your reaction to others' success expose about your own insecurities? What happens when our coping mechanisms are no longer effective? What happens when our desire to be understood outweighs our willingness to understand? What does your response to being ignored say about your expectations in relationships? What happens when comfort becomes a barrier to change? What does your relationship with rest reveal about how you value yourself beyond productivity? What does it mean to be present when your mind is elsewhere? What happens when we romanticize resilience but neglect recovery? What does your tendency to apologize or not reveal about how you perceive conflict? What do your contradictions reveal about your evolving identity? What happens when we measure worth in visibility rather than impact? What does your reaction to silence in conversation say about your emotional safety? What is the difference between emotional expression and emotional exposure? What happens when we lose the distinction between boundaries and barriers? What does your reaction to someone else's vulnerability reveal about your own emotional boundaries? What happens when systems reward compliance but punish authenticity? What does your relationship with uncertainty reveal about your sense of control? What happens when care becomes a form of control? What does it mean to be seen beyond your function or role? What happens when values are inherited rather than examined? What does your instinctive response to criticism reflect about your internal narrative? What happens when we mistake clarity for truth? What does the need to always be productive say about our fear of stillness? What happens when we confuse acceptance with passivity? What does your personal definition of success reveal about your emotional priorities? What happens when we refuse to acknowledge internal contradictions? What does your response to others' emotional needs say about your own unmet needs? What happens when we internalize expectations we never agreed to? What does your instinct to fix instead of feel say about your emotional habits? What happens when the pursuit of purpose becomes a source of pressure? What happens when tradition becomes a mask for avoidance? What does your reaction to silence from others reveal about your relationship with validation? What happens when emotional labor is expected but never acknowledged? What does your understanding of freedom overlook about shared responsibility? What happens when we treat inner conflict as a flaw instead of a signal? What does your discomfort with praise say about your self-concept? What happens when loyalty to others contradicts loyalty to yourself? What does your reaction to failure in others reveal about your own relationship with success? What happens when honesty is used as an excuse for harm? What does your relationship with uncertainty reveal about your psychological resilience? What do your patterns of decision-making reveal about your relationship with regret? What happens when we confuse peace with avoidance? What does the urge to constantly explain yourself suggest about past experiences of being misunderstood? What happens when we confuse attention with affection? What does your fear of conflict say about your perception of safety? What happens when we inherit guilt that doesn't belong to us? What does your response to obligations say about your sense of autonomy? What happens when we seek validation from spaces that cannot offer it authentically? What does your definition of independence reveal about your hidden dependencies? What happens when we romanticize struggle instead of addressing its root causes? What does your resistance to help say about your beliefs around worth and weakness? What happens when we perform openness without practicing it internally? What does your instinct to withdraw under pressure reveal about your trust in others? What happens when we suppress discomfort in the name of harmony? What does your impatience with others reveal about your own emotional state? What happens when we conflate self-expression with self-awareness? What does your perception of fairness reveal about your worldview? What happens when your desire to be understood outweighs your willingness to listen? What does your emotional response to boundaries suggest about past experiences with control? What happens when empathy is extended only to those we relate to? What happens when we adopt beliefs out of fear rather than conviction? What does your reaction to others' silence reveal about your emotional needs? What happens when we reduce complexity to convenience? What does your discomfort with stillness suggest about your internal pace? What happens when your values conflict with your habits? What does your reaction to not being chosen say about your relationship with self-worth? What happens when we use identity labels to limit rather than expand understanding? What does your fear of disappointing others reveal about your inner expectations? What happens when we inherit unresolved emotional narratives? What does your interpretation of failure reveal about how you define learning? What happens when success becomes disconnected from fulfillment? What happens when we avoid difficult conversations to preserve comfort? What does your fear of being irrelevant reveal about your search for meaning? What happens when self-sufficiency becomes a shield against connection? What does your instinct to avoid vulnerability say about your emotional resilience? What happens when we confuse security with freedom? What does your reaction to ambiguity say about your tolerance for uncertainty? What happens when we prioritize speed over thoughtfulness in decision-making? What does your sense of urgency say about your relationship with time? What does your need to control situations reveal about your trust in others? What happens when we fear being misunderstood rather than appreciating diverse perspectives? What does your discomfort with silence say about your relationship with introspection? What happens when we expect people to meet our unspoken needs? What does your perception of normality reveal about your exposure to diversity? What happens when we normalize superficial connections over deep, meaningful ones? What does your reaction to unpredictability say about your attachment to stability? What happens when we avoid confronting our biases for the sake of social comfort? What does your internal narrative sound like when you are faced with disappointment? What happens when we confuse knowledge with wisdom? What does your definition of success reveal about your inner fears? What happens when we ignore the long-term consequences for short-term gain? What does your reaction to others' growth reveal about your own evolving identity? What happens when we value appearance over substance in relationships? What happens when we place our worth in the hands of others' opinions? What does your reaction to ambiguity say about your need for certainty? What happens when we confuse independence with isolation? What does your fear of not being enough say about your relationship with self-compassion? What happens when we avoid confronting our privilege for the sake of comfort? What does your approach to change reveal about your emotional adaptability? What does your instinct to protect others reveal about your sense of responsibility? What happens when we prioritize individual gain over collective well-being? What does your reaction to conflict say about your emotional regulation? What happens when we mask discomfort with humor or distraction? What does your definition of justice overlook about systemic inequalities? What happens when we prioritize intellectual achievement over emotional growth? What does your resistance to vulnerability say about your capacity for trust? What happens when we confuse clarity with certainty? What does your relationship with competition reveal about your self-worth? What happens when we prioritize efficiency over human connection? What does your need for external validation say about your internal security? What happens when we settle for the familiar, even if it doesn't serve us? What happens when we ignore our body's signals for the sake of productivity? What does your desire to be liked say about your fear of rejection? What happens when we allow convenience to dictate our choices? What happens when we avoid discomfort to protect our emotional comfort? What does your approach to failure say about your relationship with growth? What happens when we define others by their mistakes rather than their potential? What does your instinct to control chaos say about your need for order? What happens when we expect too much from others without communicating our needs? What does your reaction to someone else's success reveal about your feelings of inadequacy? What happens when we prioritize harmony over honesty in relationships? What does your need to always be in control say about your trust in others? What happens when we confuse self-sufficiency with emotional independence? What does your response to being challenged say about your willingness to grow? What happens when we avoid making decisions due to fear of making mistakes? What does your reaction to loss reveal about your attachment to the past? Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. I'd love to know your thoughts, so feel free to answer the questions in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more content. See you in the next video.